They're taking half your check starting next month.
Half? For their mistake?
If you get a Social Security check, the agency can now take half of it back for a mistake that might not even be yours. Linda spent 31 years running the front office at a public school outside Columbus. She retired at 66, did everything by the book, and never missed a payment on anything in her life. Then a letter showed up from the Social Security Administration. It said she'd been overpaid by more than $11,000. Not because she'd lied on a form, not because she'd hidden income. The agency had simply gotten her own calculation wrong. And 2 years later, they wanted the money back. The letter didn't ask. It told her, starting next month, half of her monthly check would be withheld until the balance was paid off. Half, automatically. No hearing, no phone call first. Here's what almost nobody realizes going into retirement. This isn't rare and it isn't personal. It's a mechanism built into the system itself, and the rule that decides how much of your check disappears has changed 3 times in the last 2 years alone. So, how does a government agency's own error become your bill? And if it happens to you, what actually stops it? Quick note before we go further. I'm not your advisor, and nothing here is personal financial or legal advice. What this is the briefing, the plain explanation of how this rule actually works. So if you ever get a letter like Linda's, you're not reading it cold. If that's useful, the like button tells me to keep making these. Here's the plain version. If you collect Social Security, retirement, survivor, or disability benefits, and the agency decides you were paid too much for any reason, they can start taking it back automatically. As of right now, the default is 50% of your monthly check. Not a payment plan you agree to, not a request. Half, gone, the next time your deposit hits until the balance is cleared. That's the rate for Title II benefits, retirement, survivors, and disability. If you're on SSI instead, the rate is different. 10% of your monthly payment, and that one hasn't moved. 50% sounds like a number on a page until you put it next to a real check. Take someone living on $2,000 a month. This isn't a slow drain. It's $1,000 every month simply not arriving, while rent, groceries, and prescriptions stay exactly where they were. And this isn't a proposal or something working its way through Congress. It's the standing rule, active on every notice the Social Security Administration has sent since late April of 2025. So the first thing to understand is this. The 50% isn't the worst version of this rule. It's actually the middle one. Most people assume a federal withholding rule like this has been 50% for years. Something settled, something predictable. It hasn't. Look at what's actually happened just since early 2024. Before that, the default was 100%. If the agency decided you owed money, your entire check could stop until it was repaid. No partial version, no cushion. Then in March of 2024, under pressure over exactly this kind of hardship, the agency dropped the default down to 10%. For about a year, that was the rule most new notices carried. Then, in March of 2025, it swung back, all the way to 100% again. Full checks stopped entirely for anyone with an open overpayment. That lasted about a month. On April 25th, 2025, the agency settled on the 50% default that's still active today. 100 to 10, back to 100, down to 50, inside about 14 months. That matters for a very specific reason. If you're going by something you read a year ago, a friend told you, or even an old government letter still sitting in a drawer, the number in your head is very possibly wrong. The version of this rule that applies to you is whatever's active the day your notice goes out. And we'll come back to why that timing detail is worth paying close attention to. Here's the part that catches most people off guard. When a letter arrives saying you were overpaid, the natural assumption is that you did something wrong. You forgot to report income. You missed a form. You broke a rule you didn't know about. So people feel ashamed and they quietly start paying it back. But the numbers tell a different story. According to the Social Security Administration's own Inspector General, tens of thousands of overpayments trace back not to anything the beneficiary did, but to the agency's own calculation and system errors. In fiscal year 2022 alone, roughly 73,000 overpayments were tied to mistakes the agency itself made. A miscalculated benefit. A record that didn't update. A system that paid the wrong amount and only caught it years later. Now, to be fair and accurate about it, this isn't happening to most people. The agency's own reporting shows that improper payments, checks for the wrong amount in either direction, make up less than 1% of everything Social Security pays out. So this is a real risk, not a universal one. Most checks are correct. But if you're one of the people it does hit, the reason it happened almost doesn't matter to the machine. This is the cold part. Whether the mistake was yours or theirs, the recovery process runs the same way. Same 50%, same automatic withholding. The system doesn't pause to ask who is at fault before it starts collecting. If you've ever gotten one of these letters, or you're getting one right now, tell me in the comments what state you're in. I read them, and it helps others realize how common this actually is. So, how do people actually end up here? There are two common paths, and it's worth knowing both, because the second one can catch you even when you've done nothing wrong at all. The first path we've just covered, the agency's own error. A benefit calculated wrong, a system that didn't update, a mistake that surfaces years later with your name on the bill. The second path is more mechanical, and it snares people who are still working. It's called the earnings test. If you claim Social Security before your full retirement age and you're still earning a paycheck, there's a limit on how much you can make before the agency starts holding back benefits. For 2026, that limit sits around $24,480 a year. Here's how fast it adds up. Picture a 64-year-old who claimed early and is still working a solid job, say $50,000 a year. That's about $25,000 over the limit. Under the earnings test formula, the agency withholds $1 for every $2 above the cap. Do the arithmetic, and that's roughly $12,760 in benefits held back over the year. If they didn't adjust their withholding in time, that can land as an overpayment notice. Now here's the one piece of genuinely good news in this whole story, and it's important you don't miss it. The money withheld under the earnings test isn't gone forever. Once you reach full retirement age, the agency recalculates your benefit upward to credit back the months that were withheld. You get it returned to you, spread across the rest of your retirement. So the earnings test isn't a penalty, and in the way it feels like one, it's a delay. But, and this is the trap, while it's happening, it can still generate a letter, and that letter still triggers the same recovery machine as any other overpayment. The system runs the math. It doesn't make exceptions for good intentions. But here's what the letter never tells you. None of this means you have to accept the number as written. It doesn't mean you have to lose half your check every month until it's paid. And it certainly doesn't mean you have to just trust that the agency got the math right the second time when it got it wrong the first. There are 3 separate lawful ways to respond to an overpayment notice. They do different things, they're for different situations, and the order you reach for them matters. Most people never learn a single one of them exists. They just start paying. Let's fix that. Track 1. Dispute the amount. This is for when you think the agency is simply wrong, that you weren't overpaid at all, or not by nearly as much as they claim. Given what we just covered about their own error rate, this is not a long shot. The tool here is a request for reconsideration, Form SSA 561. You're not asking for mercy, you're asking them to check their work. And while a reconsideration is pending, you can ask them to hold off on collecting until it's resolved. Track 2. Request a waiver. This one is different. A waiver says, maybe the overpayment is real, but it wasn't my fault, and I can't afford to pay it back. Both of those conditions have to be true, not your fault, and genuine hardship. If they are, the agency can waive the debt entirely, meaning you may not have to repay it at all. This is the track for someone like Linda. The error wasn't hers, and clawing back half her check would put real strain on her monthly budget. Track 3. Request a lower withholding rate. This is for when you don't dispute that you owe the money. You're not fighting the amount. You're not claiming it wasn't your fault. But 50% of your check disappearing overnight would genuinely hurt. You can ask the agency to collect at a lower rate, stretched over more time, so the repayment fits what you can actually live on. 3 tools: dispute it, waive it, or slow it down. And you're not limited to picking just one. Someone might dispute the amount and, at the same time, request a lower rate in case the dispute doesn't fully land. The point is that the automatic 50% is a default, not a sentence. There's a formal off-ramp for every version of this situation. The system just doesn't advertise them. Now, the single most important thing about all 3 of those tools: they work best when they're fast. Because the moment that notice goes out, a clock starts. If you do nothing, the withholding begins automatically. You don't have to agree to it. You don't have to sign anything. Silence is treated as consent, and the money starts coming out of your check on the agency's schedule, not yours. But if you act inside the window, filing a dispute, requesting a waiver, or asking for a lower rate, you can generally get that automatic collection paused while your case is reviewed. That's the whole game. Acting early doesn't just start the process, it can stop the bleeding while the process plays out. Here's where I have to be precise with you, because the timing is exactly the kind of detail that's easy to get wrong. The window you'll see quoted isn't always the same. Some official guidance points to a short window, on the order of 30 days, to respond before collection kicks in. Other reputable sources, citing the original 2025 notices, describe a longer window, closer to 90 days, to file an appeal. These may be measuring 2 different clocks, one for pausing collection, one for a full appeal, and the exact number can depend on your specific notice. So I'm not going to hand you a single number and tell you to bet your check on it. Here's the safe rule instead: treat the deadline as short. Read the actual letter you received. Your notice states your specific dates, and act inside the first 30 days, not the 90th. If you move early, you're covered under either interpretation. If you wait, you're gambling on the more generous reading being the one that applies to you. When it's half your monthly income on the line, that's not a gamble worth taking. So what happens to Linda? Remember where she started. A letter, $11,000, half her check about to vanish for a mistake the agency made, not her. Feeling like she'd done something wrong when she hadn't. Here's the thing. A situation like hers is close to the textbook case for the second track. The error wasn't hers. Losing half her monthly check would genuinely strain a fixed retirement budget. That's precisely the combination a waiver exists for. And even if the waiver weren't a fit, she still had the first track, the right to make them recheck the math that produced the number in the first place. Cases that start exactly like Linda's are far more often resolved through reconsideration and waiver than through someone quietly surrendering half their income for a year. The difference between those 2 outcomes wasn't luck. It wasn't a lawyer. It was knowing the off-ramps existed and acting before the clock ran out. So let's bring it all the way back to where we started. This is an automatic legal mechanism. The default is 50%, though remember, that number has moved 3 times in 2 years. So check what's current the day your notice arrives. If the agency decides you were overpaid, whether the mistake was yours or entirely theirs, the recovery runs on its own unless you answer it. And you have 3 ways to answer: dispute the amount, request a waiver, or ask for a lower rate. The only real mistake is doing nothing and letting the machine run. If you didn't know any of this before today, you're exactly who this was made for. Now you know it, and the next person in your life who gets one of these letters might only find out because you told them. One last note, and I mean this plainly. Everything here is general information, not advice for your specific situation. The forms, the deadlines, and the details on your notice govern your case. So read that letter carefully, and if the numbers are significant, talk to a qualified professional or contact the Social Security Administration directly before you decide how to respond. If this was useful, subscribe. This channel is where we take the parts of retirement nobody explains and make them make sense. And tell me down in the comments. Had you ever heard that they could take half your check for their own mistake? I'll see you in the next one.